Wow, okay, here we go.
Hello.
So I had thought about, I'd seen the film, I'd seen both, and I had thought about some questions that I wanted to ask you about, mostly process-based questions, and thinking about the transition from making mostly two-dimensional work and installations to filmmaking. And then I saw the film again. And that's not where I want to start.
Okay.
But I think I do think those would be useful questions to start with, perhaps. And we chatted a bit beforehand about relationships. And I think if we bring that to all of the questions that we have and to talk about the relationships, it might be a good way to keep them connected. So maybe starting with the first one.
Okay.
You have a very articulated and I think very masterful project in painting and collage, and working, I think, with some really powerful and I think really provocative subject matter, with your mother sort of at the center, but also around Black femininity and sexuality. And I'm wondering just if you can maybe explain a little bit, how did you depart from some of those material modes of thinking and seeing and doing into the project with your mother, in particular the film?
I guess for me, I don't necessarily see it as different than my main practice in my studio, or departure, because when I conceived of the idea, I was still thinking about portraiture and collage and the same subjectivity that I do in my other bodies of work. I think the only departure was the medium that I was working with, that it was a new territory, it was a new sort of mode of a tool that I haven't really worked with. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, it was a departure from my practice and really thinking about how can I use this new medium that I've never worked with, but still think about it in the same way as I make my collages. And that was very important to me, to make the film feel like a collage of images and storytelling, but maintaining the essence of portraiture. And I think that was the foundation for me, really wanting to capture the idea of what a portrait is beyond the image. I've used my mother in my work for many years, actually for about 10 years. And when she became extremely sick, I remember her saying to me, "Oh, you don't want to use me anymore because I'm not feeling well." And that sort of resonated in a way. It was like I had to call the question my own ideology of why I was not using her, being that my work was formed around ideas of beauty and image and perception and the artifice. And I thought, well, is it about that? Is it that surface? For her to call the question to me that she thought I wasn't using her because she had lost what she perceived for herself a major quality, which was her beauty. And so I wanted to really, really think about that in my own practice and find a way of using her again. And I initially thought with video was the best way. And then the producer I worked with on a film suggested that we do it in film, that the film, using film would really portray exactly what I wanted. And at the time I wasn't thinking that. But I think there was no other medium that I could use to really bring this to the forefront and this sort of collage.
Yeah.
I still think of it as a collage.
Yeah. I think it does actually have all the qualities of your collage work and of your painting, and I do think that there is a very powerful relationship. I think that, you know, when I use the word kind of departure, I think your practice is very much an interdisciplinary one that has, you know, it has loyalties, and it has physicality. But what I loved about some of the things about the film that are so wonderful is that it doesn't feel separate at all from your other work. And I think it is because you kind of bring a lot of pictures within pictures to the
that
sensibility.
was very important for me to have those elements repeated throughout the film.
And there is there's like just the way that you're kind of mixing photography and, you know, in the film, you've got photography, you've got some Super 8, you've got a kind of a collage of your own work kind of being brought in to create a context and a history between you. But then you've also, you know, the thing that kind of blows a lot of my kind of aesthetic and sort of more formal questions apart is that you also then somehow create this kind of hybrid story, or this sort of indistinguishable story of two people at the same time, you and her, and the relationship is, I think, extraordinary in and of itself. And then what you've done with the film is you've managed to run her story and yours in this kind of unique, sort of symbiotic scenario.
That was probably in making the film very difficult to. I actually shot a lot of footage, probably over like 12 hours of footage, and I don't know if that's a lot for filmmakers, but for me it was a lot.
It's a lot
of just sitting in conversation with her, and it had to be spread out over a period of time because she was sick and she was in and out the hospital during this filming, and so for me, I really was trying not to have myself be so in the film. Like I really wanted my voice to be present, but not so much where it was driven or, you know, orchestrated so much by me, my voice, my person. I wanted the essence of me in there somehow, and that's why I would sort of slightly bring my voice back in there occasionally to remind the audience, one, that there's a conversation, two, that it's an interview, and three, the relationship of my mother and myself, to really sort of keep that throughout the film. That was very important for me, and a decision that was actually, you know, the editing team and producers wanted me to take out, but I really thought it was important to have my voice be present, because otherwise it wasn't necessarily about, you know, my mother narrating and telling her story, but about me asking questions. And, you know, I do have plans to make this longer so you can really hear some of the questions I'm asking her when she's basically answering them. And a lot of things I didn't even know, and it was quite surprising. There's some times when you hear my response, and one of them when she talks about when Eugene went to jail and that she kept the business going.
Okay.
That was something I never knew. Okay. And it was quite shocking. And my response I had to remove because it was like it took the story in another way, because I had to ask other questions about, you know, moments that happened that I remembered during that time that just was like, oh, now I understand why this happened, and we moved here, and it just called upon all of these situations during that period.
Well, and I think that, you know, we have these relationships with our parents, but in particular daughters and mothers have these relationships that have a kind of intensity to them that I think is really reactualized in the film. It's sort of, you know, there's a brand new relationship that the two of you have as it relates to your art practice, which she obviously, I mean, this is of extraordinary meaning for her. This is you made me, she says that in the film, the model, the star of the art world, but also it's like it's your relationship has this new frame around it that then through the film, which is kind of part portrait, part documentary, part self-portrait.
Yeah.
I think you bring some real important questions to the foreground around what's disclosed between family members, how much do we really know about each other, that this is a time-sensitive project, this life. And I think that by hearing your voice at the beginning, she says something and then you say, I'm shooting the film now, I'm rolling. And I think by hearing you both at the very beginning, I think that tells us that it's about the both of you. Yeah. And I can't imagine the levels of complexity that you would have encountered over the course of the process of making it. So I'm just trying to figure out how much. You've already said you're going to make it longer, but this is 23 minutes. I mean, this is a very brief, in many ways, a very brief film, but it doesn't feel 23 minutes long at all. I felt, I was shocked when I realized again that it was short, because at the end I felt like I'd been watching something much longer. Yeah. So
I think there's elements where, it's 23 minutes. I think there's elements of just really understanding, we don't really go into when she said she wanted to reconcile the relationship. That's not really sort of talked about. It doesn't really come through. It's there. It's lingering, but and you can get that something happened, whether it was we became estranged because her drug abuse or my sexuality. It's never really talked about. I actually omitted it from the film, but I think I want to bring it back in. I think there's elements to some of our conversation that I took out because I wasn't ready to present that. And there were people that I just didn't want to expose. And after shooting the film and presenting it for my museum show at the Brooklyn Museum, and certain family members saw it, and getting their approval and seeing the film and what it was actually about, I think now I could sort of add things to it. It was decision making and protecting people, because it is quite sensitive. My grandmother was really hesitant to be a part of it, and so was my uncle. There were people who were just not knowing what my mother was going to say and how I was going to depict her and myself and them. Yeah. My grandmother and grandfather, my grandfather's deceased, but my grandmother's still living, and out of respect, it was just certain things that, you just don't want to expose, or it's not my story to tell, it's my mother's story. Yeah. So I needed her to be the sort of navigator in how the story was going to unfold. And so I really, and with, her permission, even, for a long time, for many years, my mother would never tell people that, or people did not know that she had been a drug addict. And she she was very severe drug addict. And for a long time, she would not share that. So for her to share that now is to open up a door, Pandora's box, as you will, with my family members who are kind of uncomfortable about it. So, it was like all of these other things that are unfolded because, them being quite religious, it's like you just don't talk about those things. Like, you're fine now, you went to rehab, we don't need to really share this darkness, this side of us. And so there was a lot of situations where my mother finally come to terms with it later in life to share that part of her. Like a lot of her friends and coworkers did not know that part of her. So when they saw it, they were quite, because, I mean, she didn't necessarily look like she was during the time she was. And it was nothing, it wasn't sort of something that she shared. And it wasn't something that I shared either, because I was a part of my life that I was sort of embarrassed about.
Well, and maybe that's where it gets some of its mental length. It's why it sort of feels like it's long, because it has a depth to it. And I think the pacing of it is very particular. You allow her, I think she used the word compassionate, and I would argue that you have employed a kind of a compassionate perspective, but also I feel like there's compassion in the amount of space you give her to talk about it in the ways that she feels comfortable, and you don't do anything to disrupt that. You follow, I think very strategically, but also I think very beautifully, let her navigate the narrative, and you kind of follow with reinforcement. I'm also taken by there are the scenes, especially at her birthday party, where she tries to talk about what's not being said by sort of not saying anything, and there's that one image of you, and there's nothing kind of being said in that moment, where she says, when I started to kind of know what you were up to. Yeah. And then it kind of moves very quickly into the art world. And it's about you being an artist. Yeah. But I just love that you didn't interfere with that. Yeah. And especially for an audience now, early on in this versions, now that we know there's going to probably be a different extension of it, but to allow audiences to fill in some of their own experience too, with the intensity of those relationships, and how as we grow up and become who we are, how we have to reconnect at some point through some way with our parents. Yeah, I think it's just really beautifully crafted in that realm.
Yeah, I think that had a lot to do with me really trying to understand, in some ways, that my mother is her own person. And aside from her being a mother, sister, and all of these other attributes that she carries with her, I really wanted it to be about who she is and her failures, her aspirations, her successes, and just this trajectory of someone's life, of how, even though it doesn't come out the way you intended to, that it does in the end. That somehow, it was, that I believe that we were the two people we were for a reason. Mm-hmm. That I was the type of daughter that she needed me to be, and she was the type of mother. And somehow, some way, and the way in which I became an artist was not only for me but for her. And that's, because growing up, I never thought I would be an artist. I thought I would be a lawyer.
Right, you went to go to law school, didn't you?
Yeah, and so, and then how I came into art was through art therapy to deal with the fact that my mother was a drug addict, and so, and I made these series of images, and so it became this sort of cyclical 360 in a way that was out of my control. It was like, and so my teachers, through school just really pushed that direction to deal with that, because it was something that we were just, I guess we sort of chose each other. Yeah,
and it seems too that you're getting into the difficult subject matter, or the difficult emotions or feelings. You're getting to those things in both the film and in the conversation that we're having now,
Yeah.
I think in a very unique way. It doesn't feel rushed. It feels like, the time was taken to kind of come to a place in time that made sense for both of you. And, I guess before we open it up for questions, I think that in and of itself, the clear physical distress, like the sickness that you introduce early in the film, I think it changes how we understand the importance of it being about her. Yeah. And I think that that's a beautiful thing, and a hard thing to do for a daughter. But by someone's with watching someone's parent come close to death is a very difficult thing. But the way that you have navigated it, I think, has real resonance.
Oh, thanks. Because there came a point through filming, and I don't know if some of you realized the dictation in her voice, how it became really slurred. It was the last shooting. My mother was really sick. And it was the time when I went with the crew and realized she was going to die. And so that's why you don't really see her face. Right. Because she's like really sick and nodding and slurring and drooling. And so you can hear in her voice how it becomes this like, and that was the moment when I knew she was going to die, that this film had to be made. Yeah. Yeah. So I guess we can open it up to questions.
Let's take some questions.
I was just saying, I love your work, and it's just wonderful that you're here, and thank you so much for the film. And it's so unique when you talk about coming into your art practice from art therapy. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Okay. Well, I had moved to Portland, Oregon in 1989 for love and for school. And I, went to school out there, and then, decided what I was studying wasn't necessarily what I wanted to do. And I chose Portland, Oregon, mainly because I could move as far away from my family as possible. And also I was, dealing and come to terms with myself and my own sexuality, and, couldn't really do that in New Jersey with my family because they were very religious. And so when I moved out to Portland, Oregon, my mother was really heavy into drugs. And so, and we became estranged. I stopped speaking to her for a period of 4 years. And I had to, because I just couldn't deal with the fact that she was an addict and my family wasn't really dealing with it. And so one of my good friends who was living in Portland was doing this artist retreat and invited me to go with him, and it was an art therapy retreat. And so when I was there, it was a weekend-long retreat, and while I was there, I did these series of drawings that came out, and it was about sort of what I was experiencing in my relationship with my family. And so when I returned back to Portland, I had some friends who were artists, and musicians, and one actually worked on a film, Thomas Lauderdale from Pink Martini. He did the music in the film. Saw these drawings and really encouraged me to go to art school. They thought they were amazing. They were these crazy oil pastel portraits that I did. And it sort of just was the beginning of coming to terms with some of the issues that I was suppressing and not dealing with at the time. But it just gave me the insight and courage to pursue art. Not only at that time, it was simultaneously, I saw Carrie Mae Weems' show at the Portland Art Museum, and she had her retrospective up, and it was the table series photographs that really resonated with me because they were all about family and, sexuality and gender and, family, mother and child sitting at the table. And so that's when I decided that I was going to go to art school after seeing those images and making those drawings.
Did you, I saw an interview with the two of you.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't you use drawings that you did?
Oh, yeah. There was one drawing that she, based from a photograph that I saw at the show, that I took a picture off and did an oil pastel drawing based of one of her photograph images. And it was the one where it's the fairy goddess in the mirror, and the black woman's looking in the mirror and saying, "Mirror, mirror," on the wall, and who's the prettiest of them all. So, and this is not you, bitch, or something, but it's, a black woman looking into a mirror and she's seeing a white fairy goddess.
Yeah.
And so those were a lot of the things that sort of I responded to, and I did some drawings based off that of Carrie Mae Weems' work. And,
it just seems like it was a point for you where you could kind of allow yourself in a way.
Yeah, I was
through
searching. I was sort of trying to find myself and figure out who I was and what I wanted to do. I was very confused, one, because I was extremely far away from my family. I had no family members in the Northwest. I was there basically by myself.
Sounds like you needed some time.
Yeah, it was. I mean, I wouldn't change that for anything. Because most of the people that I know from there, I'm still friends with, and they're all artists and doing their thing. And it was what I love about working with someone who knew me for a long time, Thomas Lauderdale, is that when I approached him to do the music for this film, he just knew exactly from watching a film exactly which music to use at which time. And it was just like, I didn't actually, when he gave me the selection for the different moments, I actually didn't have to change any of them.
Wow.
I was just like, and I think it's because he knew me.
He knows you well.
And he, watching the film, he just knew exactly where to insert the different music. And I just thought it was the music in this film. It's one of the things that really carries it through. I told him what I wanted, what music I was interested in, and he just did his genius.
That's great.
And for me, because during my mother's addiction, she lost a lot of photographs.
Okay.
And so that's the reason for me having to use a lot of found footage, because she lost all her wedding pictures.
Yeah.
There was a lot of photographic images that we just don't have anymore. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so I had to be creative.
Quick question. I'm just wondering the influence of your father or your stepfather in your work, if any.
That's a good question. I think the influence of just the male figure in my work is, I think, a lot of women are who they are because of the lack of a male presence or the presence of a male. And so I wouldn't necessarily say that they're that influential. I'm not that close with my father, actually, since my mother has passed. And my mother died shortly after the film, and on November 7th. And since then, my father and I have been speaking. I haven't really talked to him for many years, but he came to my mother's memorial, and he refused to see the film. He doesn't want to see it because he thinks it will drudge up too much emotions for him. But when I was interviewed through the New York Times for this film, they had to do a lot of fact checking because they had to, the part where my mother says, my father put a gun to her head and raped her. That was something I learned when I interviewed her. I did not know that. And so my aunt spoke to my father, and he admitted to everything. But he didn't want to see the film. And so I think as far as a male presence and my work, I think I make the work that I make because there was a lack of male presence, you know. But I think maybe that's why I like to reside in a space where I'm a little androgynous. Maybe that's what it is. I don't know, but I don't think they have that much influence. I think, you know, they're actually, I'm closer to the stepfather than I am my father. He's actually, he did see the film. He wanted to see it. And he was actually still very close to my mother. And he was and he apologized. He feels responsible for my mother's addiction because he brought drugs into her life. And so, you know, he's been a very sort of gentle person and supportive. So that's been nice.
That's amazing in a way, and not expected necessarily, but.
I thought it was an amazing film. You mentioned a couple of things I was interested in your comments. You mentioned whose story is it to tell, which I think is a very interesting concept, which you mentioned you were going to explore it a bit more. I'm not sure whose story it is to tell. But in that vein, I wanted to recommend that you see a film by a Canadian director named Sarah Polley. She made a feature documentary called Stories We Tell. Okay. It was released recently. You might have an opportunity to see it in New York or to rent it. But Stories We Tell is a family story. She's exploring her relationship with her mother, trying to understand her mother. Her mother died when she was young, but trying to explore it through talking to other members of the family, their perspective on her mother, but also specifically exploring secrets, things that weren't talked about, not allowed to be talked about, maybe alluded to, buried, and so forth, trying to, through multiple perspectives, trying to understand her mother and get to know her. So that's a recommendation that you see that film in terms of expanding maybe into a feature length.
Yeah, I think that's great. Thank you.
And also, I just wondered if you did get to know your mother better through this.
Absolutely. Actually, you know, my mother and I, you know, she's a character, as you can see through the film. It comes out, her personality, especially that part when she just breaks into like preacher mode. When filming, like that was just her being her, and she just busted out when we were filming, and we're just like, let it roll, okay. she's on a roll. And you know, growing up, my mother was always that parent that, and still, you know, as an adult, all my friends, like my mother was always that person where everyone loved. She was always that made people I was always jealous of that. That my friends would always say, your mom's the coolest. And I'm just like, you don't really know my mom, one of those kids. But as an adult, I really got to know and see and appreciate what other people saw and appreciated. And I was really happy that we became good friends. Like we could talk about anything. Yeah. I learned a lot about my mother's sex life, which was quite interesting. And like we talked about everything. And I mean, you know, like I did lose a best friend because, you know, as an artist, I could call her at any time and sort of just vent and tell her my fears and things. And because we developed that type of relationship where it was beyond mother and daughter. It was like two girlfriends. And I appreciated that. And I learned a lot sitting in front of her and her telling her story to me, not only to me, but with a crew of people, a lighting person. Like, it was really powerful to look at her with a different gaze, and not necessarily as this is my mother, but really appreciate her as her own person. And I just have so much respect for her and understand that, you know, she made her own choices and it had nothing to do with me.
Mickalene, Deirdre,
Yes.
hi, over here.
Hello.
I think that's all the time we have for more formal audience questions, but I'm proposing that perhaps if you have more questions, we can take them up informally out in the lobby. Thank you for your questions today. And Mickalene, thank you for your generosity. And Deirdre, for your questions.
Thanks a lot.
And thank you all for having me here. Thank you.